Op-Ed by Doug Bandow for the National Interest, a conservative magazine. Mr. Bandow is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a former special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire, published by Zulon, 2006. Months after the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi and a day after his death, fighting continues in Libya. Even Tripoli recently saw a brief but unexpected gun battle. A majority of Americans now are critical of President Obama's decision to go to war, which of course he claimed was not a war. Libya exemplifies an aimless foreign policy supported by a purposeless alliance, yet another war of choice after thousands of lives and more than $1 trillion are expended in two other unnecessary wars over the last decade. Even if the Libyan war counts as an American victory, the benefits pale compared to the costs. Libya gave the lie to the dubious doctrine of responsibility to protect. This was no humanitarian operation. Yes, the Gaddafi regime was brutal, but its forces had massacred no civilians before the campaign to save the Libyan people. Like other civil wars in third world countries, this one generated most of its killing through the fighting itself. Yet after pushing through the United Nations resolution authorizing military action to protect civilians, NATO launched a slow-motion campaign designed to achieve regime change at minimal Allied cost. Total Libyan deaths are uncertain, but likely run into the tens of thousands. Most of them died after the conflict was lengthened by minimal, half-hearted Western action. The last pretense of humanitarianism disappeared when the alliance continued bombing the remnants of Gaddafi's forces after his regime collapsed. NATO airstrikes persist even today, though Gaddafi's forces are largely defeated and threaten no civilians. Not that the Allies imagined regime change would take so much effort. Western governments thought a few days of bombing would topple Gaddafi. Last week, 8 months after the uprising began, Lieutenant General Ralph Jodis II, commander of NATO's air campaign, conceded that we're all surprised by the tenacity of the pro-Gaddafi forces. Alliance spokesman Colonel Roland Lavoué was even more befuddled. Just does not make sense to see what these few remaining forces are doing. Moreover, by relying on non-existent atrocities to justify their operation, the Allies risk reaping the usual consequences of crying wolf. The Obama administration's Libyan adventure also means future Western operations, even with better justifications, are less likely to receive United Nations backing. China and Russia expressed chagrin when the Allies used a resolution authorizing, quote, humanitarian, unquote, action in Libya to promote regime change. They aren't likely to be fooled again. They certainly will demand a higher price for any future acquiescence. Worse, the Libya action will discourage other pariah regimes from coming in from the cold. Muammar Gaddafi both sponsored state terrorism and developed nuclear weapons before making a deal with the West. He then became the Allies' new best friend, a model for cooperation with the West. Senators John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Joseph Lieberman even flew to Tripoli to discuss providing him with military aid. Then, after Gaddafi abandoned any means of retaliation against militarily superior foes, the Allies took advantage of his weakness to oust him. Other governments took note. The North Korea Foreign Ministry opined, Libya's nuclear dismantlement, much touted by the U.S. in the past, turned out to be a mode of aggression whereby the latter coaxed the former with such sweet words as guarantee of security and improvement of relations to disarm and then swallowed it up by force. The Allied agreement was an invasion tactic to disarm the country. What state, finding itself in Washington's gun sights, is likely to voluntarily disarm? Of course, if I may put in a personal aside, the arms industry certainly will get lots of new orders after other third world countries see what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. Back to the article. More mundane but of greater immediate danger is the potential spread of conventional arms from Gaddafi's multiple arsenals. Warned Peter Bouquert of Human Rights Watch. Weapon proliferation out of Libya is potentially one of the largest we have ever documented. 2003 Iraq pales in comparison, so the risks are equally much more significant. The Gaddafi regime is thought to have accumulated 20,000 portable surface-to-air missiles, many now missing. Richard Clark, former White House terrorism advisor, worried that, quote, the probability of al-Qaeda being able to smuggle some of the Stinger-like missiles out of Libya is probably pretty high, unquote. On my recent trip to Afghanistan, military officers said they were watching for any anti-aircraft missiles which might fall into the Taliban's hands. The war's impact on terrorism remains another worry. Only hatred of Gaddafi held together the disparate rebel forces. Some insurgents fought against U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. A former Guantanamo Bay detainee holds a top position in the opposition leadership, Warned Walid Fares. The Islamist militias within the rebels are the most organized, widest network, quote unquote. Moreover, Islamic extremists rounded up by Gaddafi during his pro-Western phase have been released. The evolution of the new Libyan government also remains uncertain. The National Transitional Council has only limited control over the armed factions now effectively ruling most of Libya. The NTC forces, an amalgam of violent jihadists, tribal opponents, and liberal Democrats, imposed vigilante justice, including more than a few murders, along their way to victory. Amnesty International estimates that NTC is holding more than 2,500 people without charges. Detainees who NTC officials admit often are beaten in order to extract confessions. Black Africans have been arrested en masse on the assumption that they were Gaddafi supporters. Russia's UN ambassador Vitaly Churkin emerged from a briefing by the head of the UN support mission in Libya citing, quote, violations of human rights and international human law, unquote. The NTC may eventually create a liberal democracy, but the outcomes in Kosovo and Iraq suggest otherwise. There are plenty of historical examples when good guys who helped oust dictators ultimately lost to bad guys with guns. Iran and Nicaragua come to mind. NATO now owns the result, whatever it proves to be. Not that the alliance can claim to be surprised. During the extended fight for control in Libya, NATO occasionally threatened to bomb the rebels if they harmed civilians. One WAG suggested the possibility of using the same NATO planes to bomb both combatants to save fuel. Nor is Western involvement in Libya likely to end anytime soon. General Jodis said the continuing resistance of Gaddafi supporters demonstrated the need for NATO's ongoing military involvement. And Max Boot and Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations call for an outright Western occupation. Finally, Libya demonstrated that the United States gains little but loses much by remaining part of NATO, initially created to contain Soviet communism. Then, European survival was seen as a shared vital interest. Now, the alliance is a transmission belt of unnecessary wars. With the demise of the Soviet Union, Europe and America no longer face a common existential threat, or even many shared security concerns. The alliance survived on inertia. American officials enjoyed having allies to, quote, lead, unquote, even though the latter were able to defend themselves. The allies liked being defended by a superpower willing to do the heavy lifting in any conflict. As a result, the George W. Bush administration pressed the Europeans to join its counterproductive invasion of Iraq. Severe divisions of the alliance prevented any collective NATO response, but several individual members sent troops. The Allies responded more positively in Afghanistan, in part to show solidarity after 9/11, and also because many European states consoled themselves that they're engaged in nation building rather than a traditional military occupation. 2/3 of NATO's 28 members have joined other nations to back U.S. counterinsurgency operations. Particularly notable is the participation of NATO wannabes, such as Georgia and Macedonia. Hoping to win the perceived benefits of membership, international status, financial aid, military guarantees, these small countries have joined the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, in Afghanistan. The NATO complement performs a useful role, but Washington would do better if it withdrew its forces from Europe and eschewed assistance from countries that joined because they believe doing so would obligate Washington to come to their aid in a conflict not involving America. Libya reversed this process, with Britain and France avid for war and the United States more reluctant. The Obama administration gave in while attempting to limit Washington's involvement. As it was, only 8 of NATO's 28 members contributed militarily. Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen nevertheless argued the conflict was a positive story, that the other states contributed to our command structure and the funding of certain activities, as if that were the equivalent of military action. In fact, complained Michael Clark of the Royal United Services Institute, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that NATO emerges from this successful operation weaker than when it went into it. The war highlighted the Europeans' limited ability to carry on combat operations, even against the weakest of international opponents. In this case, a fading despot facing a popular revolt. And that is before the large budget cuts planned by virtually every European government. Fogh Rasmussen conceded that Washington provided unique and essential assets, an obvious understatement. However, he continued, this is actually the essence about being an alliance, that we help each other. Precisely how are the European countries helping America? By forcing it to provide everyone with everything they lack. No amount of, quote, smart investment, unquote. NATO's new mantra can make up for Europe's military weakness. All told, the Libya war was quite an achievement for NATO in a almost completely negative sense. Anne-Marie Slaughter, a well-known advocate of, quote, humanitarian intervention, wondered whether anything would be worse than Colonel Gaddafi staying on by increasingly brutal means for many more years. The many thousands who died in the war might answer yes. So, too, might the hundreds of thousands killed in the violence unleashed by Washington's invasion of Iraq, as well as the millions murdered in other revolutions gone awry. Ms. Slaughter and other ivory tower fans of war as a progressive tool should rediscover the virtue of humility. No one should mourn Colonel Gaddafi's passing. The author's words, not mine. But Washington is likely to pay a far higher price than commonly assumed for conducting regime change under the guise of humanitarian rescue. And now I would like to make an analytical note. As you may know, I believe that to save the U.S. from its current crisis of corruption and mismanagement, we need to engage left libertarians, small government conservatives, progressives, and sensible people generally. Therefore, I am always glad to discover conservative viewpoints that point to an alliance between conservatives, independents, and progressives. People who are interested in ideas, regardless of the source, who think for themselves of all persuasion, are so much more interesting to hear than people who repeat what they are told by people they think are on the same side as them. I do not believe my views can be pigeonholed as left or right. I believe people should have equity stakes in the services and resources they need, and that as each of them becomes essentially a micro business owner, we benefit from automation, outsourcing, and computerization, as we are owners and not wage slaves. Small business poverty eradication, whether you call that libertarian or communitarian, that's sort of my basic view as the next step in economic development. Now, as far as the Libya intervention is concerned, this intervention has been conducted recklessly and violently at every point in its prosecution. Rather than engaging in the subtle arts of diplomacy and engagement, we unleashed complete devastation on a small, prosperous, tightly controlled belief state. For some reason, our entire media decided to make this conflict into a cartoon story of good versus evil, unwilling to ever utter a number of indisputable facts. One, that Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa per the CIA fact book, as well as the United Nations Human Development Index, especially for its poor citizens. Libya had better social welfare programs for its poor citizens than the U.S. They had, everyone had housing, and there was no food insecurity in Libya, unlike the United States. Two, that it was secular and had equal rights for blacks and women. And three, that underlying its socialist secular state was a complex web of tribal and regional relationships. The U.S. and NATO, rather than seeking a way to help Libya achieve greater democracy while retaining its prosperity, universities and medical services, etc., ended up propelling a small minority of Islamic extremists into positions of power. It is absolutely reckless and incompetent foreign policy, and incredibly savage and brutal. It is no surprise that Gaddafi was beaten to death after capture, based on the example that we set in Libya. The thuggish way that Gaddafi was handled was the logical fulfillment of exactly what this witless warmongering administration created. The new Libya was created by Obama and Clinton, make no mistake. I don't want to hear about France or Britain. Without the U.S. backing, without the U.S. imprimatur, this invasion would have not happened. Instead of a prosperous, peaceful police state that needed constructive engagement first, certainly, before violence, to endow its citizens with greater freedom of political expression. Instead, we have created a land riven by animosity, with brutal gangs roaming the land. Gangs the Obama administration enabled to do things like lynching of blacks, opening fire on loyalists, rounding up and beating and torturing of loyalists. This policy can only be described as the most devilish way possible to destroy a country. Maximum fury of assault, minimum of due diligence, that is, researching and understanding Libya, and showing itself very clearly when Hillary Clinton cackled, "We came, we saw, he died." This also shows what political appointees, rather than real professionals, do, how they can provide real damage to our image throughout the world. To cackle such a thing after we showed no interest in diplomatic engagement, after we hired a woman who has no professional training in diplomacy or foreign service, is a logical outcome of a political appointee. Obama's mistake in trying to duplicate Lincoln's method of getting all his adversaries into his administration was in not seeing what happened to Lincoln, where he had a very incompetent prosecution of the war. There must be some linkage between those two facts, that Lincoln slaughtered millions or hundreds of thousands of northern states' troops through incompetent generals